Hi everyone, welcome to GLY 2030 Earth and Environmental Geology. My name is Joe Mert. I am your instructor for this course and your teaching assistant is Agnes Corey. We will be teaching this course for the first time, both of us. However, I've been teaching here and at other universities for more than 30 years, including courses very similar to this one, but not this exact course. We will have office hours. Those office hours will be posted early next week. We urge you to take advantage of those. Anytime you have a question, if for some reason you're not able to make those office hours, please drop us an email and we will schedule a time that is convenient for both of us and make sure that we get to you. Since this is an online course, it is somewhat self-paced. However, there are strict deadlines for each of the assignments. So please make sure that you stick to those deadlines. It's okay to get a little bit ahead. I set each assignment's opening date a little bit ahead of when it's due, at least a week ahead of when it's due. If some of you find that you want me to release those assignments a bit earlier so you can get a head start, that's fine. Shoot me a line. I'd be happy to open those up a little bit earlier, but the deadlines are firm. So please make sure that you pay attention to those deadlines and you get things done. If you have any trouble, computer trouble accessing the course, please let us know immediately and we'll do whatever we can to make sure that that gets fixed. Let's start with four simple questions or four questions that are of interest, and I hope that every one of you takes some time just to think about this for a moment and answer these questions. There's no right or wrong answer. You can answer that however you want. And certainly that not everyone in the class will agree with what you have to say. There will probably be some people who dissent, and you're just going to do this on your own. I'm not asking you to post this anywhere. Just do it for fun. And I'll give you my answers just so you know. So let's start with, what is a concept or a discovery that you are extremely skeptical of, you meaning me in this case? And then follow that up with, what do you have absolute certainty about? And by absolute certainty, I mean absolute scientific certainty. And scientific certainty is never 100%, as we will discuss in some depth later in this video. So the concept that I'm extremely skeptical of, you can see on the top of this slide, is that the Earth is flat. Yes, it used to be a long time ago in some cultures, humans thought that the Earth was flat, that there were edges that you would sail off of. That was not held by everyone. In fact, Eratosthenes, a long time ago, actually determined to first order the circumference of the Earth by simply looking at the shadow that a pole cast in a hole in ancient Egypt. But nevertheless, people still believe that the Earth is flat. And the percentage of people who believe that the Earth is flat in the US ranges somewhere between 4 and 10%. So that's a high number. 10% is about, 3.5 million people in the USA believe that the Earth is flat. I am very certain, scientifically certain, that the Earth is in fact a broadly spherical in shape. It's not a perfect sphere. It depends on how accurately you measure it. But by and large, it's a spherical shape. Why am I confident about that? I'm confident about that by simple observation. We can see the Earth from space. We can see how the curvature of the Earth affects things coming up over the horizon. There are very easy ways to show that the Earth is in fact spherical in shape. The second question in here is, do you have free will? And this one's more fun, okay? Because I would like to think that, yes, I have free will. I can decide if I want to go inside. I can decide if I want to go outside. And that choice is mine and mine alone. Nothing is influencing that decision other than my brain synapses firing the way that they will to make me decide whether I'm going to go inside or outside. There is a debate, however, in both philosophy and physics, and the physics is the one that I really like, which states that those electrons that fire off those thoughts in my brain have predetermined paths. and that in fact I don't have free will at all, that everything in there is pre-programmed, so that my answer to this question, my showing you this slide, my discussing the material on the slide is all predetermined. I had no choice in that. It was going to happen no matter what. It's kind of fun to think about. And if you're interested in this idea, I encourage you to go to YouTube. There is a good debate by a couple of physicists talking about whether or not there is such a thing as free will. And I would encourage you to take a look at that. The last question is, why do people turn away from science? And I don't know the complete answer to this. I know that in my lifetime, I have seen people grow more and more skeptical of science, and I'm not fully sure the reason. I think there are several. I think one is that scientists are not very good communicators of their science. We tend to be insular people. We tend not to talk normally to people when we describe our science. And we tend not to necessarily go out into the public and talk about our science at all. That's changing, but it needs to be something that we do more and more often. But in reality, I think that one of the reasons is that with the advent of the internet, with AI, with social media, it's very easy to think of something, to develop a favorability towards one argument or another, and you can go online and you can find information that confirms your ideas, right or wrong. It confirms your ideas, and the more you look for confirmation, it's called confirmation bias, the stronger your beliefs come. And they may not have any, they may not be real at all, but you can find them on the internet. And you may know this, you may not know this, but social media feeds you what you like to see. So when you like something, when you watch a video of something, you will be fed more and more videos of that. So you can insulate yourself in a mini reality that reaffirms all your ideas. Just try it. Try looking up flat earth arguments on Instagram or something. You will start getting more and more feeds about flat earth, and you can really confirm, if you want, you can live in a world that is flat by simply ignoring all the evidence that's contrary to it. So I think there's a combination of that. I think that also that access to information has made people wary about everything, and so it's much easier to just find those things that you believe in, find evidence for the things that you believe in, and confirm the things that you believe in without ever having to look at any other viewpoint. I don't know if that's the whole reason, but that's something that I've seen happen in my lifetime. Okay, so I thought this would be fun and interesting. I went on to Amazon and I had some ideas about what some people think are controversial topics, and I just looked for some book titles. And so these claims you may have heard before. You may go, I didn't know people believed that. I didn't know that was a thing. And that's fine. But just take a moment to consider your immediate reaction to some of these titles. And I'll just go through them. The first one, chemtrails are not contrails. And you see the picture there. I think you can see the picture there of this sky with, you know, lines, white lines across the sky. Most of us, at least I always thought when I looked at these, well, those are planes flying through the air and they're leaving their contrails. That's what happens when planes fly at high altitude, and that heat coming from the engine interacts with the extremely cold air at high altitude, and you get these ice crystals forming, and they leave a trail behind the plane. And the winds at altitude can create really cool patterns with these contrails. But apparently, someone somewhere decided that the government was actually putting chemicals into the upper atmosphere to change the weather, to change your behavior, to inoculate the population against something. It's really, to me, I'll have to be honest with you, it's a little bit bizarre. because we know the physics. We know what happens when planes fly up at high altitude. And we know that there are air currents up there that can create unusual patterns. We know sometimes planes turn. We can see the crisscrossing trails because at certain I happen to be a pilot. At certain altitudes, you fly in an east-west pattern at a certain altitude, and at others, you fly north-south at a certain altitude only. So it's not unusual to see crisscrossing patterns of airplanes. But some people have decided that these are not contrails, that they're actually the face of evil, as titled in this book. One that's extremely frequent, at least in the news, if you listen to the news, or if you listen to politicians, is this discussion of election fraud in the US and elsewhere. And election fraud is real. I won't pretend that there is no election fraud whatsoever on the face of this earth. It happens. What we do know, and what it has been studied over and over and over again, is that it is extremely rare. There has never been a case that has been documented in the US that clearly shows that someone interfered with the voting machine, someone interfered with the election to cause a completely different result to occur. We have very safe elections. I've worked as a poll worker, so I know the security that surrounds these. Um, the machines are tested. Everything is as secure as we can get it. Doesn't mean it can't happen. It doesn't mean that at some point in time, someone can get into those machines somehow and change votes. All of that is theoretically possible. What I'm telling you is that there's no evidence to support the fact that it has ever taken place on a massive scale in US elections. It just doesn't happen. It also doesn't mean that we shouldn't watch out for it, that we shouldn't continue to have high security around our elections, that we shouldn't have secure voting machines and all that. I think that's all great. But there is no massive doctoring of election results in the US. And yet some people believe that elections have been stolen, that the wrong people are in office, et cetera, et cetera. But the facts are, and legal cases support this, there is no widespread election fraud that has occurred in the US. Another one that's become very popular recently is this idea that vaccines cause autism, that there's a direct link between autism and vaccines. And this is being pushed by the head of Health and Human Services in the United States, is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who thinks it very clear that autism and vaccines are linked, that if we should not be giving children vaccines because doing so creates the opportunity for uh, autism to develop. What's interesting about this claim is that autism appears to be on the rise, but it's not truly on the rise. What's happened is that our diagnoses, our ability to diagnose the different spectra of autism has increased. We've become more knowledgeable about the problem, how to deal with the problem, diagnosing that, and then helping people who are somewhere on the autistic spectrum, help them to live a normal life. So yes, we've recognized it more, but there has been no clear link between vaccines and autism. The bad side of that is that there are individuals who now are refusing to take vaccines simply because they think that there's a danger to those vaccines, when in fact there is very little danger associated with any vaccine. And again, I don't mean to say that there aren't some side effects that people have. There are people who have allergies to certain things within the vaccine, so they can have adverse effects. But overall, in a general population, which is what science looks at, we look at general population. The general populations, the studies tell us there's no link between vaccines and autism, and that overall, most vaccines are safe for most people. Always consult your doctor, of course. Um, Not a geologist, but I do read the science. One of my favorites is Bigfoot. I like the idea of Bigfoot. I don't believe Bigfoot really exists, but it's kind of fun. Um, I just wonder why nobody ever gets a good picture of Bigfoot and nobody ever really gets a good picture of a UFO. For whatever reasons, I guess maybe people get nervous or something like that. But it is fun. It's fun to think about Bigfoot. I personally see no compelling evidence to suggest that Bigfoot exists anywhere at any time. Um, and there's a couple of others here. One is that the Earth is young. So there are people who think that the Earth is not 4.5 billion years old. They believe that the Earth is only 6,000 years old and that 4,000 years ago there was a flood on Earth. Um, and yet geology, what's interesting, and I'll talk about this in a future discussion. What's interesting is that geology kind of assumed that that was the case, that the Earth was young and that there was a global flood. And why did we think that? Well, we look at the geologic record, we see lots of dead animals. Well, okay, we have a story that tells us that all these animals were killed in a flood, and sure enough, there's a bunch of dead animals in the geologic record. So it's what's interesting is that geologists said, yeah, there might be something to that. But as we examined the evidence, we quickly realized that a flood and the geologic record simply do not match in any way, shape, or form. And so we disposed of that idea over 150 years ago, and we continue to find more and more evidence that tells us that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old and that life evolved over a long, gradual sequence of events with some interesting transitions. And we'll talk about those in this class. And the last one is another one that I think is kind of fun. And that is the one you can't see because my head's in the way, but it's psychic. And one of the most important points to remember about all of these claims is that many of them will attempt to use science to support their arguments. And that really makes a claim sound convincing, but we always have to be cautious whenever scientific sounding language is used as evidence by itself. Okay, so I'm going to talk in scientific language, but if we just use the scientific language and we try to make links using scientific language to convince someone of an argument, that's not necessarily the way that science is done, nor is the way that we should evaluate science. So, as an example, some psychics argue that because electrical activity in the brain can produce measurable wave patterns, and because energy can behave as waves, then it should be possible for someone with special skills to detect or interpret the waves coming from another person's mind. Now, those individual statements may sound scientific, at least some of them, okay? That does not mean that the conclusion follows from those statements. So, two statements can each be true without necessarily proving the third statement. And this is an important distinction, okay? In scientific thinking, evidence must actually support the conclusion being drawn from it. And we also need to recognize the danger of confirmation bias, and that is the tendency to accept information more readily when it agrees with what we already believe or want to believe. And even scientists are susceptible to confirmation bias because scientists are human like everyone else. And the critical difference here, in science at least, is that science has mechanisms to correct itself through testing, through replication, through criticism, through peer review, and the continued search for contradictory scientific evidence. These ideas are constantly challenged. And when the evidence shows that an idea is wrong, science gives us a framework for recognizing that mistake and changing our conclusions. So science is always trying to improve upon itself. So when you encounter a claim that sounds scientific, don't simply ask, does this sound like science? Ask the more important question, and that is, what evidence actually supports this claim? Okay, so I've talked about a few, ideas that have been thrown forward and controversies that have been pushed forward by various people in and how science attempts to deal with those. But I thought it'd be fun. Let's look at an actual case study. So let's look at a situation where scientists had a disagreement and how that disagreement led to different conclusions and how scientists actually examined the evidence in a critical manner and came up with a solution. So the images I'm showing here are from a very important scientific discovery that was made in 2020, early 2020, just before COVID closed the world down. So what I want you to do is take a look at these pictures. They're all the same thing. Okay, one is a drawing, one is a photograph, and one is a spectral photograph, but they're all the same thing. And I just want you to write down your guess and know that this is just a fun example. If someone showed me this, I would have probably guessed the wrong thing as well. So just take a guess. You can see here, this is a scale bar. It tells you that's about 10 centimeters long. So that gives you some idea of what size this is. So I'll give you a few seconds just to write down what you think this is a photo of. Okay, so what is it? Well, it's quite interesting, and it's actually it actually got quite a bit of press. The discovery made headlines around the world, and you might ask, well, I'm not even sure what it was. Why did it make the New York Times, and why did it make, why was it on the Weather Channel and YouTube and all kinds of things? Well, the reason is that this fossil, it is a fossil, um, was found in a sedimentary rock whose age was highly debated. And in fact, the age of these rocks has been debated for well over 100 years. And there's one group of geologists, myself included, that argued that these rocks are actually 1 billion years old. There is another group, however, that argued that they were much younger, that they were only 550, 600 million years old. Now, you might sit there and go, "Whew, big deal. What's 500 million years amongst friends?" And at first glance, you would be absolutely correct. But it's not a minor detail. And the reason it's not a minor detail is because these sedimentary basins are typically hosts to economically viable minerals, such as oil and gas, for example, things that we use every day. They can also host rare earth minerals that we use in computers and cell phones. They can host economically viable minerals such as gold and silver. And in order to figure out whether those sedimentary basins are actually good hosts or bad hosts, we have to know when they formed, we have to know in what environment they formed, and we have to know in proximity to what other continents or other oceans they formed. So we have to know a lot about these sedimentary basins in order to evaluate whether they can actually host economic deposits. So it's not simply an academic question as to what the age is. It actually has larger implications. And so this discovery was quite interesting because the fossil itself was called Dickinsonia tenuis, and it's a remarkable fossil from a period of geologic time called the Ediacaran. And the Ediacaran period, geology is divided up into time periods. The Ediacaran period is an interval between 538 million years ago and 635 million years ago. And so the discovery of this fossil, incidentally, the discoverer was the world expert on Dickinsonia. And they made this discovery almost on accident. They were on a tour just before a big meeting in India, which eventually didn't happen because of COVID. But they did find this, and they found this on the walls of a cave in India. And the significance of the find was immediately apparent. They knew what they saw. They published this very, very quickly. And the conclusion was striking. And the conclusion was simply this: these rocks are 550 million years old. There's no way to fit Dickinsonia tenuis into a billion-year-old sedimentary basin. It just doesn't work. So to me, when I read this, more than a decade, and I mean more than a decade, probably 15, 20 years of my research was down the drain and potentially wrong. And I wasn't the only one. There were a number of us who thought that this basin was a billion years old. Now, needless to say, that was quite humbling to find that out, and to find it out from a world's expert on Dickinsonia tenuis was even more humbling, because I thought, well, I'm not a paleontologist. I'm not an expert on this fossil. I think my ideas are a bit cooked. But this is where the scientific process is especially important. So for two reasons. One, as a scientist, I had to accept the implications of the new evidence, even though it contradicted my own research. At the same time, accepting that result does not mean accepting it without question. So I said, okay, this looks pretty good to me. I don't know how I can fit this into a billion-year-old sedimentary basin, because it's quite clear this fossil only occurs in rocks that are about 550 million years old. So a good scientist wants to test, verify, and reproduce important results. Now, unfortunately, COVID-19 had other plans. Our ability to conduct fieldwork was put on hold for several years, and that prevented us from returning to the field and to test those conclusions ourselves. Let us have a look at that fossil. Again, I'm not a fossil expert, so just looking at the fossil maybe would have made me feel more comfortable saying, yeah, I was wrong. That's pretty good evidence that that's exactly what that fossil is, and I just have to move on. But the experience illustrates one of the most difficult, most important aspects of science. You have to be willing to change your mind when the evidence demands it, even when the evidence challenges years of your own work. So the scientific implication of this discovery was the rocks are 550 million years old. That's it. There's not an easy way to debate that. That discovery, if confirmed, if validated, I'm wrong. And just to give you an idea of that, this wasn't just a one-off in the press. In 2009, 2010, we presented some evidence suggesting that those people who thought it was 550 million years old were actually wrong, because we had evidence that we thought was very strong, pointing to a billion years. So again, this was in the press. Major Indian basins are 500 million years older. So this is stuff from my research that took place some 10 years before this discovery of Dickinsonia tenuis. Well, finally, after being unable to conduct fieldwork during the COVID-19 pandemic, we were able to return to India in 2022. And so naturally, one of my first priorities was to visit the locality and take a look at this fossil for myself. I just had to see it. I had to admit, okay, that I need to see this fossil. So I remain skeptical. I won't tell you that I immediately accepted this. I just kept thinking, well, maybe there's something. Maybe they were wrong, but I had to admit, on the face of it, it was me who's probably wrong. So that distinction is important, because being skeptical means you have to be willing to test a claim and not simply reject it because it conflicts with your own ideas. Before I went there, though, there was one thing about the discovery that continued to trouble me, and that was that there was only a single fossil clearly visible in the outcrop, even though the authors reported two smaller fossils could also be seen. So when we look at their drawing, you can see here's the big fossil, you can see it here. And they also said, oh, there's a little one here and maybe a little one over here, or a little bit bigger one over here. So they claim to have seen three impressions of this Dickinsonia. Okay, that's not huge evidence. That's just me spitballing and trying to say, okay, well, generally when you find fossils, you find a bunch of them on bedding planes and they're all over the place. So why would you just find one or even maybe two or three? Now, knowing that I had a strong personal stake in the outcome, I was accompanied by two graduate students and I was accompanied by my Indian colleague. And I told them all that I'm going to be very skeptical, but I want you to hold my feet to the fire and don't let me see only what I want to see. Because I knew confirmation bias could influence my interpretation. But in this case, there was another danger, and that's rejection bias. And that's a tendency to dismiss evidence simply because it contradicts what we already believe. So I strongly thought that these basins were a billion years old. Here was evidence flying in the face, smack dab hitting me over the head saying, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. So my goal was not therefore to prove that the discovery was wrong. It was to examine the evidence as objectively as possible and then let that evidence lead where it may. At my heart, I'm what's called a field geologist, and I like to look at the big picture whenever I come to a new place. I don't like to run up to the fossil. I like to say, okay, let me look at what else is around here. What's going on? What do the rocks look like here? What other information can I glean from this site? So when we got there, there were some immediate red flags flying in my head, rejection bias, and some were prejudiced to be sure, and others were more scientifically based. First of all, I did go look at the fossil, not right away, but I did go look at the fossil, and it was in a weird position. Fossils tend to be found on flat bedding surfaces. This one was curved and terminated in the vicinity of two small bees' nests. Now you can see one of those bees' nests here in this picture from 2019. Here's that same bees' nest in 2022. But even more intriguing to me was to think about the age of this fossil. So this fossil was 550 million years old. And between 550 million years ago and 2019, that fossil appeared mostly intact. You can see the fossil is very well preserved here. And yet, 3 years later, when we went to look at the fossil, more than 50% of the fossil had disappeared. That's strange. So, again, it's not evidence of anything. There's lots of explanations. There could have been people, peeling off samples of the fossil trying to test it. There could be many explanations for why 50% of that fossil was disappeared in 2.5 years. But it was intriguing to me, intriguing enough to continue to look around. As I did that, and again, this is my modus operandi, this is what I do. I began looking carefully around the site rather than focusing only on that fossil. And almost immediately, I noticed something that was unexpected, at least unexpected for me. And that is that the area was covered by abundance of giant bees' nests. And this photo is taken from about 40 or 50 feet above my head. Okay, and you can see these kind of black items here. I've highlighted them in red. Here's some more of these, and here's one of these bees' nests, well above my head, but they were all over the place. And so I immediately turned to my students and I said, could this have some relationship to all of these bees that we see around? Because the fossil itself terminated in a couple of smaller bees' nests. So I asked my students, I said, let's go photograph these nests. And at the same time, let's continue to search for the outcrop for additional fossils. If this is a fossiliferous bed, we might be able to find more fossils and then, settle the score. And the more we looked, the more interesting the situation became. So eventually we began to suspect that perhaps we were not the ones suffering from confirmation bias, that the original authors might have been the ones suffering from that bias. And they had found what appeared to be a remarkable fossil and interpreted what they saw in that context. But that was only a hypothesis, of course, and we needed much stronger evidence before drawing any conclusions of our own. Now, this locality was designated as a World Heritage Site, and World Heritage Sites are protected. So we couldn't go up and actually dig out the sample or do any sampling there without going through a long process of getting permission. However, we could photograph the outcrop in as much detail as necessary. So we documented everything we could, the supposed fossils, the surrounding rocks, and more importantly, the numerous bees' nests throughout the site. Now, our challenge was now to determine whether the evidence supported the original interpretation or suggested something completely different. What was even more fun about this is that my son, who's a UF graduate, had taken a beekeeping course from a professor, and I contacted that beekeeping professor at UF and I said, hey, I'm going to send you these pictures. Can you tell me what you think they are? And one of the pictures that we found was a bee's nest that had been decayed. And I don't know if you can see this well or not, but this is part of the decayed bee's nest. And to me, it resembled, and again, this is from 30 feet below, or 30 feet above my head, resembled very much that fossil Dickinsonia tenuis that we saw on the cave ceiling that became so famous. And so immediately I called, well, I didn't call him, I emailed him, and he said, yeah, that does look like a bee's nest. And so then I thought, you know what, I'm going to go back and look at that publication. I'm going to go back and look at what that expert found. And here is that picture from 2019. There you can see the bee's nest. Here you can see that second fossil that they claim. And so I took the picture that was in the publication and I zoomed in on it, and sure enough, what did I see? Honeycomb structures. Well, guess what? Dickinsonia tenuis doesn't have honeycomb structures, but you know what does? Bees. And so what happened indeed in this case is that the scientists saw what they wanted to see and ignored the rest of the area. And this is an important lesson. Implicit bias affects scientists just like it does everybody else. So the happy ending was that the original authors, after we published this, they retracted it and they sent an email and a reply to our article, and they admitted that they had indeed made a mistake and that they had identified a bee's nest, a modern bee's nest, as a 550 million year old fossil, and that their conclusions were therefore negated and wrong. So a good lesson. I will say, I wish I could say now I'm right and we know they're a billion years old, but that debate continues to this very day.